Hello, everyone. How is everyone doing? Are we coping well? I'd like to say that I'm getting used to this online sphere that we're in, but I feel like it's going to take a little bit longer. Before we begin this week's lecture, I'd like to first thank you all for being so accommodating as we get into the new groove of online learning. I'm really impressed by all of your ability to shift into this digital sphere, and I'm pretty excited to see how the rest of the semester is going to play out. That being said, before we dive into this week's lecture, I'd just like to go over a few things. First, I'd like to start by letting you all know that the Living Writers event section of your grade, so if you remember when we were going over the syllabus, it's with 10% of your grade, it's canceled. I've chosen to not do a different assignment for this, and instead all of you will just receive a grade of 100%, so a full 100 for that section of your final grade in the class. It's my gift to you for kind of getting through these times. Second, I'd like to apologize for how long it's been taking me to get your first paper back to you. I have to admit that a lot of what's been taking me so long has been this shift into digital learning, but also what's been going on in the country right now. Personally, this has been affecting me in different ways of my life. Don't worry, guys, I'm not sick. But there are people I know who are, and I've been dealing with that. But also, it's just kind of been wild. I do promise that these grades are going to be in sometime this week. You're going to receive feedback from me. Don't panic. Lastly, please, please, please do not forget that your first draft of the second paper is due this Thursday. Unlike the first paper, this draft only has to be 2 full pages. So focus more on content and stress less on how polished it's supposed to sound. All right? Okay, moving on. I thought that it'd be great to begin this week's lecture with the book's title, or talking about the book's title. So some of you might wonder why Cristina Garcia named the book Dreaming in Cuban. To answer that, I want us to think to the point of the novel when Pilar is finally in Cuba. After Pilar spends some days in Cuba, she realizes that she's dreaming in Spanish, which she's never done before. And that's around 2:35. And here, I have a quote of that section. I've started dreaming in Spanish, which has never happened before. I wake up feeling different, like something inside me is changing, something chemical and irreversible. There's a magic here working its way through my veins. It's in this moment when Pilar has reached the peak of her struggle with her hyphenated existence. So prior to this point, much of the novel, Pilar has been a Cuban American, right? This hyphenation between what is Cuban and what is American. So because of this hyphenation, it's almost as if one side had to kind of give in to the other to fully exist. She can never be truly fully American without rejecting the Cuban side, and she can be never truly Cuban without rejecting that American side. And so at this point, she's with her grandmother, and it's important to focus on the fact that she's able to kind of immerse fully into the language and the beauty of Cuba, of this motherland of her family. And because of that, her ethnicity balances out. She can become really, truly herself. All right, so I hear you guys. The quote said dreaming in Spanish, not dreaming in Cuban. So, back to the title. Why are we titling this book Dreaming in Cuban versus Dreaming in Spanish? It's first important to understand that there is a difference between dreaming in Cuban and dreaming in Spanish, right? Spanish is a language. It's an official language spoken by many different countries. And because it's spoken by a variety of groups around the world, it's kind of hard to own something like that as part of your yourself, who you are. And so when Cristina Garcia titles her book Dreaming in Cuban, it's as though she's bringing Pilar's revelation closer to home. So it's more of her experience. And she also is placing the family's identity squarely on the island and the power it has. There's fire. So if Celia is associated with water and everything that it symbolizes, Felicia is very much tied to fire. And this is, sometimes it's pretty obvious. I mean, Felicia exacts revenge on her husband. So she sets Hugo's head on fire. So literally. She also burns with illness, the syphilis. It's a burning, right? And she also burns with the fire of erotic love, which is something that Celia was said to have. But unlike Celia, where Celia is able to like deal with that, she's able to suppress it. Felicia does not have those resources to deal with that burning fire of erotic love. Fire is also very symbolic in this novel as a lot of the terrible moments in her life. So when she's pregnant with Ivanito, she's nauseous, she's miserable, but she's also suffering from her syphilis, that burning fire that was caused because of her husband. There's also a way of speaking of mental illness as a fire in the brain. It's not common anymore, but it is a way to refer to that. And so this could be referred to depression. And this figurative way of thinking about fire in the brain as like a mental, or that tie to mental illness, also is shown through Felicia. She suffers from syphilis, that burn, that physical burn, but also that mental burning. On the other hand, there's also the santera, the combustible santera. So Celia brings the woman who originally told her she had a wet landscape into her, like in her palm, to the house on Santa Teresa del Mar to help her heal Javier, right? And in this moment, she trembles once, twice, and slides against Celia in a heap on the sidewalk, smoking like a wet fire, sweet and musky until nothing is left of her but her fringed cotton shawl. And that's around 160, friends. So here, the fire is, again, kind of contrasting to Celia, right? So Celia, her balancing element is water. She's unable to kind of quench that fire that consumes the santera in that moment. Another key thing to look at in this novel, and again, guys, I'm only pulling out some spots. There's so much more beyond this, are the desserts. So we spent many pages talking about things like eclairs, apple pie, strawberry shortcakes, pecans, sticky buns. Oh, the sticky buns. So much of the sticky buns. And a lot of these sweets are attributed to Lourdes at her Yankee Doodle Bakery, right? So they're obviously a product of Lourdes's like flourishing in the United States, but also these sweets, the abundance of these sweets, are also part of the reason why she kind of gains over 100 pounds, to herself. When we think about pastries, we think of them as like a luxury item. You don't need a pastry to survive, but it's nice to have it. And oftentimes we could see this connection to this luxury as like the American abundance. I mean, guys, like when we think of an apple pie, we think American as American gets, right? And it's this extraness, this decadence that kind of splits the worlds between Lourdes and Celia, right? Because Celia does not react well to seeing the pictures from Lourdes's bakery. And if you're unsure of where I'm talking about, look around 117 for that, friends. So here, these pastries are a way for Lourdes to kind of tap into the American lifestyle, but also as a way for her to kind of, I guess, like convince herself of that she's like doing all right. She's this way, this new, abundant, extravagant American way, is it better than what she left behind in Cuba? Okay. There's like two more. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the pearl earrings. And I mentioned this previously, very, very briefly, when we were talking about water and Celia. But throughout the novel, we're told that Celia only has removed the drop pearl earrings from her ears 9 times to clean them, which is pretty significant. In her very long life, only 9 times have been taken out of her ears, and it's only to be clean, like to clean them. And for the most part, these pearl earrings are kind of associated with Celia. People don't remember seeing her without them. Even characters like Pilar cannot think of her grandmother without those pearl earrings when she imagines her. So, such a stress on these pearl earrings is important to note. It's clear that the author wants us to kind of make a connection between Celia and this jewelry, and you can think of the jewelry itself, the pearl earrings, as like a symbol of that passion for Gustavo. So she wears them not because she longs for him, not that she's like, oh wow, Gustavo, like I really wish you hit me up again, but instead as like an homage to that deep desire, that strong feeling, with him and with many others. It's a strong tie, so it's an outward symbol of that strong tie of people she cares about. So then, why does she release her earrings to the sea? When she does this, it can be seen or can be looked at as her letting go of a big part of herself. Does that mean she's ready for death? She trying to reinvent herself? I don't have an answer. But it is very symbolic, a very big momentous moment when Celia gets rid of this, because they're so fundamental to who she is. And when she releases that, you can almost think of it, or a way to see this is as though Celia is kind of cleansing herself of that. She releases that. All right. Music. So, music is pretty significant for Celia, Felicia, and Pilar. For Pilar, we often see her with punk music, right? That punk music scene in New York. And when we think of punk music, it's usually very rebellious, if we look at like the history of punk. And so we can almost see that as like a way of tapping into like her energy. She's young, she's vibrant, it's got a lot of energy to it. But also it can be very angry, very hostile. And with Pilar, she is in a very hostile place for much of the novel. She does not have a good relationship with her mother, right? She doesn't know where she belongs. And this energy, this hostility is kind of shown in her desires to kind of reinvent herself, to kind of figure out who she is. So as she gets older, she, we could see that connection of that frustration and that struggle with the thump of the bass, with the fact that like she, it started as like a piece of furniture and it ends up becoming an extension of her body, right? She relies heavily on the bass. With Felicia, when we think of music, we think of Benny Moré and his music. So when she's in her like delusions, her mental breaks, what does she do? She plays Benny Moré's music, right? It's her deepest moments of the delusion that she turns to this music to kind of, I guess, center herself. And additionally, Ivanito even associates this music with his mother's own voice, right? So after Felicia dies, like he looks for Benny Moré's music on the radio. It's like it's as if he's trying to like tune into her, like connect to her once again. With Celia music, we see it like music isn't so literal here. We're not thinking punk music. We're not thinking Benny Moré. But instead, we're thinking of the poetry. So poetry is very lyrical, very musical, right? And so she recites the poetry of Federico Garcia Lorca to anyone. She really like connects to him and his lyricism as a poet. And his poetry, which these poems turned into songs eventually, are what call to her as she goes into the ocean at the end. So, now that we're done with some of the symbolism, and again, friends, please, there's so much more than this. These are just some important things I thought you might want to take a focus on or take a little look and think about. But I also think it's important to think about the general plot of this book. When we think about plot, for those of you who don't know, it's a couple different things that kind of make a story. There's a situation, the conflict, what complicates it, the climax. This is like that climax, that falling action, so to speak, and the conclusion. For Christina Garcia, much of this novel flips back and forth in time, and so I thought it might be great to look at how these plot points are kind of seen throughout the novel. So in the opening of the book, we're in the middle of a situation, right? Like, Celia's on the island, she's like guarding her spot of land, and then she's distracted by her dead husband walking toward her, right? This blue light, like, oh my God, what are you doing here? She didn't know that he died, but she sees him in this moment, right? And this initial situation is pretty much a very big catalyst for much of the rest of the novel. Jorge's death sets off Felicia's, connections with the Santeria, Pilar's journey or attempt of a journey back to Cuba, Lourdes's weight. There's a lot of things that, if you look at the events in the novel, they're all tied to this very big moment of Jorge dying. So, rising action, where things start kind of happening. We have two spots where we see rising action happening, right? We have rising action happening in Cuba, and we also have it in the US. So in Cuba, we see Felicia kind of like going a little bit more crazy. And in the section, The Fire Between Them, we actually see Felicia's tough past, or like the things that have happened to her, and kind of push her into an attempted suicide. And that's when she tries to kill her son Ivanito, take him with her. So this moment is a big one for on the island, but also on the American side, or in America, so to speak. Pilar is like in hardcore rebellion. So we have Felicia descending into madness. She's like not handling things well. And then we have Pilar not handling things well, as well. So we have her, like she doesn't like get her parents, right? We have her father cheating on her mother. We have Lourdes being Lourdes, and she asks Pilar to like paint the mural, and she gives Pilar that freedom. And here Pilar rebels against this step in freedom, right? She makes a punk Lady Liberty, but it's also a major moment between Pilar and Lourdes, because what does Lourdes do? She defends her, and that was something a little bit unexpected. It makes Pilar not see her relationship with her mother so black and white, right? At first, like, her mom's her enemy, but at this point, she's like, wow, she's like not that bad. We have the climax, so this like big crisis, this turning point. At this point in the novel, Lourdes is like, wow, she notices that her dad is not not hear as much, right? So he's already been dead, but she's been hearing his voice. She's seen him. And at this point, Jorge tells her, like, listen, lady, you got to do some stuff before I'm gone. He tells her that she has to go back to Cuba to be with her mom, apologize for him. And also, she's told of her sister's death. We have Pilar, having her own moments with Santeria, the Orisho. She sees Chango, and that's a really big moment for her, because this, for her, kind of gives her that, like, journey more into the Cuban side of herself. But also at this moment, she's assaulted, right? She's assaulted, and she also finds out she's going to go to Cuba. So this big crisis in Pilar's life kind of leads to both of them reconnecting with other parts of their family. The falling action. So we see this as Felicia's final journey, and also the actual heading to Cuba. So we have what happens with Otto, her third husband. We have her kind of dedicating herself to Santeria, really full. And she starts going through the secret, like, rituals of initiation. And here, rather than thriving, Felicia starts failing. They try to save her, but she dies. She gets really sick. While as readers we're not very surprised, I mean, at least I'm not. Please let me know if you guys were. But as readers, we weren't surprised of Felicia kind of descending into madness, but also dying. We see it happening, but for Celia, she does not cope well with that, with Felicia dying. And it's at the moment when she dies that her lost child, so Lourdes, finally comes back. And Pilar, her other half, right? They have this very thick connection with one another. She also appears. So this, like, momentous, like, return to Cuba, well, at least it feels like it should be momentous, ends up not being it. Lourdes doesn't actually leave the car when she gets to Felicia's house. She already knew about her being dead, and she sees nothing in Cuba as changing. It kind of, like, solidifies her feelings about what has happened. This is different from how Pilar sees Cuba. Pilar is like, oh, wait a minute, there's a lot going on. She had this, like, fantasy, I guess. She fantasized the way Cuba would be. She thought, oh, this is what home would be like. And instead, like, all she sees is her grandma's kind of getting old, and the country is kind of limited. And so at this point in the novel, we got to get to the resolution. And here, once Pilar sees that, that confliction, she's conflicted, right? Like, she sees, like, the Cuba in her head and how it doesn't match up to the Cuba of real life, the real world. She accepts her grandmother. She's like, wow, I love her. But also she can't, like, she doesn't belong in Cuba. This is the moment when she's like, I don't belong here. I need to be in New York. This does not mean she doesn't struggle. She has a hard time thinking of telling Celia or leaving Celia behind. But for both Pilar and Lourdes, Cuba is not the Cuba they remember. Everything is so different. There's also something that really happens that's important to think about towards the end with the conclusion is Ivanito, right? So they Lourdes kind of she kind of like props up for him the fact that he can leave. And what's surprising is that Pilar goes along with it. This does not mean that she doesn't realize that they're taking the only thing that Celia has left, her last grandchild, because Luz and Milagro, I don't even know what's going on with them. But the fact that Ivanito was the last connection Celia really has to Felicia. They're all leaving her, and Celia clings to the past. Whereas Pilar, understanding that the past has its place, pushes forward to the future. This is where she realizes, like, she can never go back here. This is it. It's the last time she'll see her grandmother. So, that ending. How do we feel about that ending, right? I know for some of you, you were a little annoyed by it. Honestly, the first time I read this novel, I was too. Most of us don't know what happens to Celia, and even the author doesn't. So right here, I have a quote by Cristina Garcia on this last scene. And this is what she says. She goes, "I deliberately wanted her fate to be ambiguous. I've been asked whether Celia commits suicide, or if she swims back to Cuba, or even if she might get picked up by the Coast Guard. My answer is always, I really don't know." So here, I don't have a good yes or no, this is what happened to Celia. But instead, it's a great way for you to think about why did the author leave it this way. Is the fact what happens to Celia important, or how she got there? And I'd caution you to really think about Celia's journey to that final moment and how she experiences that last moment. We know that Celia sheds her pearl earrings. She leaves them in the ocean, something else she's very much connected to. Make of that what you will. I wish I had a better answer. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a really good week. Enjoy yourselves. Try not to stress too much. I hope your classes are treating you well. And I'll see you all digitally next week. Bye. So let's talk about some symbolism. Before we talk about the symbolism in the novel, I'd like to make note that what I discuss in this week's lecture is by no means all the symbolism in the novel. There are a lot of ways to read this book, and more importantly, there are so many ways to interpret the action of the characters in the novel. For one thing, Garcia, she kind of writes Celia as associated with water. So we're going to start with water. There's a moment in the novel where the Santera comments about seeing a wet landscape in Celia's palm. And she tells Celia that although she has it in her to be consumed by fires of passion, she also has the water, keynote water, within her to quench them and thrive. And this line, this section, kind of rolls Celia as being both the illness and the cure together. Celia also finds great comfort in the sea. So again, water, that connection to the water that is near Cuba. So we open the novel by her sitting on the porch and she's looking out over the ocean. She's very calmed. She's lulled by the motion of the water, the starlight on the waves. And when she's upset, when she's at her rawest, she also returns to the water to kind of balance her senses, balance who she is. It like recalibrates her in a sense. This is like the water becomes a very big coping mechanism for Celia, and that continues forth until like later on in her life. So a lot of times Celia will think of the ocean that surrounds her island, and she sees it as a barrier, almost, and this is twofold. The barrier keeps her in, part of her family in, but it also keeps part of her family isolated and away from them. And also this barrier, if you think just historically, you can think of it as like a way that Cuba has been isolated from much of the other, like the rest of the world. That, all of that being said, the ocean, again, water with her, with Celia rather, it's not a bad thing. It doesn't stop her, particularly towards the end of the novel when we see Celia go to the water once again to kind of shed herself into the darkness of the ocean. And this is done obviously through her pearl earrings. Where there's water,